Hello, and welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. We left off last time with a small band of 18 pirates, including Ravno de Luzon, having just taken a small town in Costa Rica. What Luzon called the boldest, most resolute, and rashest action that could be thought of. And it was those things. If, indeed, it happened. Those 18 pirates took at least 50 prisoners there in that small town, and when those prisoners attempted escape, killed all but 8, 4 men and 4 women. When we left them, they were riding out of town on stolen horses with their prisoners tied behind them. It was all very spaghetti western. However, we're going to pick up right where we left off, once again, on the run. This is episode 141. With swords in our hands. The pirates and their prisoners were riding away in stealth, trying to be as quiet as possible. We can assume that the prisoners were bound and gagged. But soon they heard the sound of 600 cavalrymen on their trail, and they began to ride as hard as possible. The pirates, riding hard, made it to the beach, where a few of their comrades had a beachhead that were able to hold off the horsemen while they all retreated to their ships. The women were released before they headed to sea, but the 4 men went with the pirates to be interrogated. Those men told them of the possible ports they might choose. Quote, "We asked where the galley of Panama was. She lay at anchor in Caldera, where she waited for us, hoping we would pass that way to go to the North Sea, and that the King of Spain's ship, the San Lorenzo, was in the port of Realejo, mounted with many pieces of cannon and 400 men on board to hinder us." End quote. Those were the 2 nearest ports to the pirates' location, to their east and west, and the only potential landing spots aside from where they were right now. As for this landing spot, quote, "They laid so many difficulties before us that we grew almost out of conceit with it. But yet, when we considered we must either make our way through or end our days horribly, in an horrible want of all convenient necessaries, and in an enemy country where we grew weaker every day by the loss of our men, we resolved to hazard all to get out of it, being persuaded it would be better for us to die with swords in our hands than to pine away with hunger. We made all things ready for the journey." End quote. There was nowhere to land to the east or to the west. This was their only option, and there were horsemen scouring the countryside. Still, it was all they had. On Christmas Day, 1687, the pirates ran their ships aground, not on the coast, but on an island near the coast. They kept a couple of pirogues around to boat to shore, but their seaworthy vessels, those they ruined to prevent anyone turning back from this course of action. They made a decision here on Christmas Day to make this the moment of no return. Which, do we believe that? End-of-the-year holidays all have overtones of the winter solstice, the shortest and darkest day of the year. That's why we see the lighting of lights in so many traditions all across the world. And here, the pirates were at their darkest point. But they were prepared to return back home, to return to the light, symbolically speaking, and, as we see, there will be the lighting of lights. I wonder if that's a bit of poetic license on the part of Ravno de Luzon, or maybe I'm just reading too much into it. Regardless, the pirates formed into 4 companies of 70 men each, and there, on that small island, they agreed upon a buccaneer contract. The Forlorn, or the Forlorn Hope, the vanguard of the pirates, those who would be out in front of the main body, they were to be drawn randomly from each of the 4 companies every morning. Then they agreed on 1,000 pieces of 8 for any man who was lamed in battle, which should tell you how much money they had to spare here. These men were going home rich. They set out punishments for stragglers, and for drunkenness, and for violence between pirates, and for cowardice. This was all by the book. Then, quote, "On the 27th we discovered a ship passing along between the islands, which made us send our galley and pirogue to see what she was. But as soon as we came within shot of her, she took down the white flag and put out Spanish colors and gave us 10 or a dozen guns." End quote. Side note, when he says gave us 10 or a dozen guns, that wasn't a gift. They were fired upon. But that's a pirate move, isn't it? Sailing in under a flag of truce or a flag of peace, only to raise the colors and open fire with everything you have. It would not surprise me in the least to learn that this ship was under the command of one of those Biscayans, a privateer who knew these tools of the trade. Lucan writes, quote, "This vessel about noon came in with the tide and anchored within half a cannon shot of ours that were run ashore, under the cover of which we fought against them with 2 pieces of cannon till it was night." End quote. So the pirates still had their big guns on board their ships, though the ships were run aground, but they were able to have a firefight. Come dawn, though, the Spanish opened fire again with a full broadside, and the pirates were forced to take cover behind some large rocks in the shallow water just off the coast. That bombardment kept up for the better part of a day, with really little effect on either side. The Spanish then moved in closer. They wanted a better vantage on the pirates, but that's actually what the pirates wanted as well. Once the Spanish ship was in position, and even decided to drop anchor there, the pirates opened up with their cannon. They sent a few men in clandestinely to man them so the Spanish didn't know it was coming. And then, once the focus was on the cannon, the pirates opened up with small arms and chased the Spanish ship back. However, the anchor was still down. The Spanish had to send a boat over to cut the line, and all of the men on board that boat were massacred. However, the Spanish ship moved in, and under the cover of her big guns, they did manage to cut the anchor loose. That evening, the pirates sent 100 men to the mainland to ensure that they had an escape route once they made it out of this situation. Those men captured some horses and laid down a beachhead. They were prepared to put down any force that the Spanish might raise against them so that the rest of their comrades could land. That same night, to distract the Spanish from what those 100 men going ashore were up to, Lucan writes, quote, "For fear the Spanish should suspect the design we had to go to the North Sea, we counterfeited all night long the caulking of our ships, that we might possess them with a belief we were careening them. In the morning, they failed not to come up to destroy, with their cannon, the work they fancied we had been doing." He's saying they pretended to work on their ships so that the Spanish would focus on them. They would come up to destroy them. Lucan continues, "On the 30th, we made use of a new stratagem to amuse our enemies, which was to charge our guns, granados, and 4 pieces of cannon, whereunto we lighted matches. In our absence, the Spanish ship's crew might still believe we were upon the island, from whence we parted in the twilight, as secretly as ever we could." End quote. They readied their guns, pointed them at the Spanish ship, which was just out of range, and lit their matches, which the Spanish in the dark of night could see very clearly, assuming that the pirates were waiting for them to come close. While all eyes were pointed at those lit lights in the dark, the pirates slipped away on their boats, made a wide passage around the Spanish, and made their way to shore. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know what you're looking for in a pirate story or what it is you enjoy about pirates in the first place, but for me, that's it. Backs to the wall, no escape, overwhelming odds against them, the pirates use subterfuge to outwit their honorable foes. I mean, does it get any better than that? Well, I would argue, maybe. At least, I hope it does. The crossing of Central America by these French pirates is one of the lesser-known epics in pirate history. At least, lesser known to those of us in the English-speaking world, which is something I'd like to touch for a moment. We've discussed the rather fluid definition of the golden age of piracy before, and we will do so again. But exactly what, or rather exactly when, the golden age of piracy was is up for debate. The broadest definition we see is the whole of the age of sail, which is too broad in my estimation. The narrowest definition gives us the maybe 10 years following the Spanish War of Succession, centered almost exclusively in Nassau, except when they move up to North America, to the colonies. That's the period that the English-speaking world, or at least America, usually focuses on, but it's a very Anglo-American-centered view. I prefer to see it as the 60 or so years between 1660 and 1720. To my mind, that's the Golden Age, in between, say, Henry Morgan and the end of the Nassau pirates. But a large chunk of that time period was a French age. There are stories from the Buccaneers, such as this one, that are as big, if not bigger, than a lot of what we will see later on. However, they're much more infrequently talked about, hardly ever mythologized, again, at least in English. But I keep using those movie analogies in this story, and I'm trying to avoid even more of them, but I do so because this story is so cinematic. I have to try to actively avoid all of the characterization that's in my head for these players, because to me they all seem to have such vivid personalities, but a lot of that is more about subtext than, the text. The point is, though, this story is great, and someone should give me a bunch of money to write the script. Disney, Netflix, you're in a bit of a streaming war, and I know you like pirates, so let's get on that. But moving right along. Lussan tells us, quote, "On the 1st of January, in the year 1688, we arrived at the continent with all our prisoners, whom we reserved to carry our surgeons' medicines, carpenters' tools, and the wounded men we might have in this passage. The party we had sent before to look for horses had taken 68, along with prisoners, who told us they did not think it advisable we should travel through Segovia. Because the Spaniards had intelligence, we had made choice of that province. As we had already resolved upon the matter, and that our ships could be of no longer use to us, all that they could say to the contrary did not hinder us." End quote. Segovia, by the way, is part of Nicaragua, but it was at the time a colloquial name for basically the modern border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Shortly after disembarking, the crew got all of their belongings together, preparing for a march. That is to say, they had their guns and swords and water jugs, and their packs. Those were full of powder and shot, and personal effects and treasure. However, in the weeks since they had originally split up their shares, shortly after Guayaquil, a lot of money had changed hands between the pirates. They loved to gamble, and some pirates were very, very good at it. Others, less so. And many of those that were less lucky were not exactly what we would call money savvy or intelligent. They gambled, and they lost, and they gambled again to win their money back from their extraordinarily lucky, or perhaps very fast-fingered, compatriots. And sometimes they would win a little bit back to keep them intrigued, but they rarely won much of it. Thus, there were a bunch of pirates who had no money, and others who had well more than their share. The pirates who had extra money had two major problems here. First of all, they had a bunch of gold and silver which would weigh them down on their trek across country. Second, though, and perhaps even more concerning, they had a bunch of other pirates who, while they might not be able to prove they were cheating, were liable to kill them for it anyway. Pirates like Ravenel de Lussan tended to win on the big bets. He writes, quote, "As for myself, I must say, though my charge was lighter than others, it was not all that less considerable in value, seeing I had converted 30,000 pieces of 8 into gold, pearls, and precious stones. As the best part of this was the product of luck I had at play, some of those who had been losers, being much discontented at their losses, plotted together to murder the richest among us. I was advertised of it by some friends, which did not a little disquiet to my mind, for it was a very difficult task, during so long a journey, to be able to secure himself from being surprised by those who were continually in the same company, with whom he must eat, drink, and sleep. who could cut off whom they pleased in the conflicts with the Spaniards by shooting us during the hurry." End quote. Lucan is telling us that in addition to his share, he had won a total of 30,000 pieces of 8 and converted that into gold and jewels. That's impressive, perhaps a bit dastardly, but do you see what I'm talking about when it comes to characterization? That's a scene from a movie, with Lucan as the protagonist. Young, educated, probably handsome, a bit bookish what with writing his journal, but also dashing and brave, as he joined those 18 pirates who took that town last time. You can picture the drama unfolding as a group of dirty and violent buccaneers size up the right time to murder him and rob his corpse, probably on the battlefield as they fight the Spanish. However, those pirates who had won more than their share had a very simple solution. They asked the losers to carry a portion of their loot. Quote, "The apprehensions I had of this conspiracy did not hinder my judgment and presence of mind, upon such methods to secure the preservation of my life, to deposit some of what I possessed in the hands of diverse persons, upon condition they should restore unto me such a proportion as I agreed with them for. I rid myself of the care I should continually have had of keeping upon my guard, without exposing those who carried my effects. It's true I paid dear for this precaution, but what will not a man do to save his life?" End quote. What he's saying, in a very roundabout fashion, is that he asked others to carry some of his treasure, and in return he gave them some of it. His own share perhaps he carried in his pack, but the rest, his winnings, was split up between half a dozen others or so. In that way, he would lose half his winnings, but he would ensure that he made it home alive. That is, of course, assuming the Spanish didn't kill him. And that brings us to 1688. At this point, I almost wish that I'd found another story to tell, maybe that of Bachelor's Delight and Edward Davis, a story that would round out the year. Because at this point, Lucan's journal really gets broken down day by day, very much like a proper diary. It might be fun to tell his story in real time, week by week. But I did not do that, so I won't do that. 1688, though, is a big year in the story of the pirates. I mean, it's no 1492, nor is it even a 1715, but there are a ton of big events that would shake the world at large, and the world of the pirates. If you'll forgive the pun, it marks a sea change for the pirates. But we'll get to all of that much later. For now, these French pirates at the dawn of 1688 on the Spanish Main. They set out on the 2nd of January, after sinking their boats to march through the countryside. Actually, the first week is pretty dull, so it's probably for the best I'm not doing this week by week. Mostly, Lucan spends his time describing the places they stopped to quote-unquote bait, and I initially had no idea what the word bait meant in that context. I thought maybe to hunt, to set out bait for the prey to come in. But that's not the case, and if you happen to be a language nerd, as I am, it's actually kind of interesting. The term bait is kind of an archaic term that means to pause a journey to rest and eat and drink. The people who would be most likely to be familiar with that term in the modern world are probably horse people. It's still used in regard to pausing to rest and water your horses. And it appears that even by the time that this book was published in the late 17th century, it was an archaic term in English. It's more of an Old English thing, comes from the Germanic. But it seems to be the best translation they had for the French word that Lucan used. However, these pirates were not marching alone. They had their prisoners and their horses carrying some of their goods, but the Spanish were also very much aware of the pirates' presence there. But it's not as though the Spanish were just going to fall on them and attack. This was a column of nearly 300 heavily armed and very experienced killers. That's not an easy target, even for the Spanish soldiers in the region. Quote, "The Spaniards, notwithstanding all the precautions we had taken, were advertised of our departure, and failed not to let us have their company, keeping themselves always in our flanks and rear. On the 8th, we lay at a hatto, about which place the enemy began to barricade the ways. We rested at an estancia to bait, and upon a bed in an hall there we found the following letter directed unto us in these words. And now, quoting that letter from the Spanish, "We are very glad that you have made choice of our province for your passage home, but we are sorry you are no better laden with silver. However, if you have occasion for mules to carry your baggage, we will send them to you. We hope to have the French General Groenet very quickly in our power, and we will leave you to consider what is like to become of the soldiers." End quote. And that's just so good, isn't it? First of all, it shows us that the Spanish did not know that Francois Groenet was dead, but more than that, it's a beautiful kind of threat. We know exactly where you are. We could send mules or horses to you at any moment, and we are prepared to reclaim all of our silver, and we want to leave it to you to think about how we're going to do so. That's a beautiful example of psychological warfare. In fact, we're going to see a lot of psychological warfare today, a lot of irregular warfare from the Spaniards. But we have a reasonable picture of what this march looked like. This was an army, a small army. By continental standards, they would have been no more than a battalion, but in the Central American wilderness, they were an army. They were tough, haggard French pirates that were marching with their muskets loaded and their matches lit. And think about the forlorn, the vanguard that was out in front, 40 men strong, marching through woodland and over savannas, through plantations and cattle ranches, and all the while keeping their eyes constantly peeled. Every time they emerged from the trees, waiting for an ambush, every time they topped a hill, they had to stop and pause, not giving themselves away to scour the surrounding countryside. This was not a fast march. And, of course, every time they went back into the woods, that was where the Spanish were most likely to be waiting. The same day that they found that letter, when their nerves were likely a little bit frayed, they met their first ambuscade. Shortly after entering the tree line, there was a hiss, a crack, and then a flurry of hot iron that ripped through the front line of the forlorn. That's why they're the forlorn. The vanguard fired back at the Spanish, and they had the discipline and the skills to push them away, but even still, it felt easy. It looks like the Spanish were not here to destroy the pirates, but merely to harry them. To kill a few of them, which they did, but that would keep the pirates on edge, and it made them take the time to bury the dead, or at least split up their treasure and take their boots and their guns. Then they had to reload the guns that had been discharged and to refresh the vanguard. That all took time. And it was that time, as much as the desire to instill fear, that the Spanish were after. And we can say that because of the evidence at their next, most logical stopover, a hatto. And a hatto was kind of a mainstay on large Spanish ranches. It was basically just a building with food and water and shade for the ranchers to rest. They are seen still today on ranches in the American West and much of Mexico. Those hatto provided most of the sustenance for the pirates on this voyage so far, but at their next stop, they found it empty. The Spanish had used the time they bought in that ambuscade to empty the hatto of anything that the pirates could use. No food, no water, and the shelter and shade burned. It became very quickly apparent that this was the plan, a scorched earth campaign on the part of the Spaniards. Again, irregular warfare. Quote, "The Spaniards, who left no means unattempted to destroy us, burnt all the provision that was in our way, and when we entered into savannas where the grass was very dry, they went to windward of us to set it on fire, whereby we were very much incommoded, and our horses were even stifled with the smoke. As we were sometimes obliged to stay till the fire had burnt up all, to go forwards, this very much retarded our march, and this was the chief thing the Spaniards aimed at, that their men might have leisure to finish a retrenchment." End quote. The Spanish were buying time. They set fire to grasslands, which made the pirates pause. Whenever they entered into a woodland, the trail they would find blocked by pine trees, and they would have to take the time to cut through it. It made their march agonizingly slow, and worse, because there were no more cattle to hunt. There was no more food or water on their path. There was no sustenance anywhere. It was frustrating. Quote, "We persuaded ourselves that they did all this to chagrin us only, having not the courage to do worse. We passed a sugar plantation, and our company filed off, but 20 of us stayed behind at the house and set it on fire, to oblige the Spaniards to come and put it out, and this they failed not to do. Thereupon they fled, yet we, firing upon them, wounded one and took him, by whom we understood that their reinforcements were coming to dispute our passage, who consisted of 300 men. We rejoined our main body, and came to a great burrow, where we found those 300 men, who afterwards were our continual guard." And by the way, when he says those 300 men, their continual guard, he means the Spanish, not their comrades. He continues, "They gave us morning and evening the diversion of their trumpets, but 'twas like the music of the enchanted palace of Psyche, who heard it without seeing the musicians, for ours marched on each side of us in places so covered with pine trees that it was impossible to perceive them." End quote. Those 300 Spaniards surrounded the pirates, out of sight due to the trees, but constantly they blared their trumpets and beat their drums day and night. Now I have no idea what the Enchanted Palace of Psyche is. Google only gave me results from this book. I don't know if it's a French fairy tale or maybe an archaic spelling of a Bible story. If you know, let me know. But right now, who cares? There's a fight coming. The pirates found themselves on a hilltop, for fear of being hemmed in, with a strong guard around the perimeter. Just out of sight were all of the Spaniards surrounding their hill. Could you sleep in that circumstance? As the enemy blared trumpets and laughed all night long, an enemy that outnumbered you, if only by 20 men. However, no attack came that night. The Spanish were probably sleeping, in shifts though, half of them playing trumpets in the direction of the pirates, the others, ears plugged, sleeping soundly. That would keep the pirates awake all night while the Spanish got at least a reasonable night's sleep. Again, irregular warfare. I vaguely remember a news story in which the U.S. Army played, I want to say it was Metallica, all throughout the night during a hostage situation, if I'm remembering it correctly. That's a tactic that works. Come dawn, the French decamped and prepared for the day's march, which they were going to be allowed to do. This wasn't a battle they were preparing for. However, they doubled their forlorn to 80 men. And the forlorn had special instructions. The reason they doubled them to 80 men, every time they came to a wood, a tree line, half of the men were to fire into that tree line in lieu of a Spanish ambush, while the others waited with guns at the ready. According to Ravenot de Lussan, quote, "Our advanced guard were appointed to fire their muskets at the entries of the woods, in case the Spanish laid ambuscades for us. About 10 in the morning, we passed on to a place that was so thin set with wood that we might see a considerable distance, and, seeing no enemy, we did not fire at all. But we did not dream that we were seeking for that far before us, which we had at the sides of us. For the Spaniards who were ranged to the right and left, lying on their bellies, made their discharges with so much precipitation that there was no more than one half of our advanced guard who had time to answer their firing." End quote. Which is to say, the Spanish were waiting on their bellies, not to the front, but to the side, like velociraptors. Now the main body of the pirates rushed in to aid the forlorn who were under fire, but they were too late. The Spanish had already vanished into the woods. However, they left a good number of the vanguard wounded or bleeding or dead. There was another ambuscade the following day, but the pirates had learned their lesson here. They assumed nothing about any tree line, and when they fired, some of them fired lower and in a much wider arc than they had before. This time, they heard a horse scream, and presently the pirates got down low, which was good thinking. The answering salvo came from the Spanish quickly, but it flew harmlessly over the pirates' heads. When the forlorn investigated, they found blood throughout the tree line, and then a dead Spaniard, and then a wounded horse. The horse, which they shot, was even more welcome than the dead Spaniard. The pirates were hungry, not yet hungry enough to turn cannibal or anything drastic like that, but tonight, horse was on the menu. These attacks continued for several days, and they always played out in a similar fashion. The pirates were fired upon, and then, as Lucan tells us, they bravely fought the Spanish dogs back with our fusees. But they didn't fight the Spanish back. The Spanish didn't want a firefight, because the pirates always left dead men behind. Some Spaniards usually died as well, but more pirates. The Spanish tactics appeared to be working, and if things kept up in this fashion, they weren't going to be strong enough to hold back a proper Spanish attack. And even if they were, all the while, in the distance, the Spanish were building a proper defensive fortification. And that, today, is where we're going to leave the pirates, on the road, wounded and bleeding. But before we leave today, there's something that's been nagging the back of my mind throughout this story. Something about these Spanish tactics feels very familiar, and I think I finally put my finger on it. So, the pirates had weapons from all around the world, and they had the best weapons that money could buy or that they could steal. But on the other hand, the Spanish Empire had some serious, systemic problems. The empire had such restrictive rules surrounding colonial buying practices that the garrisons were always poorly supplied in this era. They were poorly armed and usually ill-prepared for any sort of battle. They were low on powder, their guns were outdated. It was an issue that would come to bite them. But their tactics, their style of warfare against the pirates here in Central America, it looks a lot like much more modern warfare as we've seen across Central America. It's a clear representation of early guerrilla warfare. And that's something that we see from all over the Spanish world. Cuba during the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century. Cuba in 1961 during the Revolution. Hell, all of Latin America in their revolutions throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Even in Spain during the Civil War in the 30s. It's a mainstay of Spanish military tactics, but it wasn't before this period. And I wonder if it came from the native peoples that they fought in their conquests during the 1500s. I wonder if the Spanish learned the best tactics from their numerically and technologically disadvantaged enemy. I wonder if they adopted that a century or so later when they found themselves at the same numerical and technological disadvantages. It's odd to think of a behemoth such as the Spanish Empire employing tactics that would later be used by scrappy revolutionaries, that were used by pirates, but it's what they were doing. However, that's where we're going to leave it, because next time the pirates are going to come to the town of Segovia and move on to the mountains beyond. Mountains that, even in Central America, they had to cross in January. If you want a preview of that, I suggest reading up on Hannibal crossing the Alps, or the Fellowship crossing Carrateras. When we left off last time, the French buccaneers led by Pierre Le Picard and Mathurin des Marais were marching across Central America. Raveneau de Lucan, a crewman and writer, inserted himself into all of the most dashing exploits, and he might actually have been involved in some of them. The pirates fought off ambush after ambush from the Spanish. They carried packs full of silver and gold and emeralds and pearls and even a few rubies and diamonds. They marched through woods and over savannas, and they died. Only one or two here, one or two there, but they were dying. The Spanish were picking them off, slowly, but every day there was another ambush or two. And it had been 10 days since they set out on 2nd January 1688. That's 10 days of roughly 4 leagues a day. That is 14 miles or 22 kilometers. And that's not an unsubstantial hike, considering the constant impending danger, the actual fighting they had to endure, and the campaign of fear conducted by the Spanish. The way that the Spaniards blared their trumpets all day and night, the threatening letters they sent, and, the actual killing. There was the campaign of fear and the violence, but on top of all of that, the pirates were suffering from hunger. Originally, they had intended to eat off the land. Lucan had written previously, quote, "Before I leave these seas, I'll spare the reader the trouble of asking how we came to endure so much hunger, misery, and fatigue. I have said that the country is so good and pleasant and fruitful in the production of all things necessary for the support and comfort of human life." He goes on to tell us that the pirates might, quote, "surprise the Spanish in our descents, where we would have wanted nothing, not only that was necessary, but also pleasurable, besides the wealth we must have carried away in a short time." But he concludes, quote, "In sight of the Spaniards, who, discovering even the least motions we made, had almost always time to remove all of their effects out of the way before we made our descent, and left us nothing they could not carry away." End quote. All along this march, the Spanish were taking the time to strip every settlement and outpost of anything that the pirates could use, the food and the water, and, of course, the shelter. The Spanish took the time to herd any cattle away that the pirates might eat, and they bought this time in pirate blood by blocking their pathways and burning savanna grass. In short, the Spanish plan was working. The pirates were dropping off, slowly, but dropping off nonetheless. But then, on 11th January 1688, the city of Segovia appeared in the distance. This is episode 142, Unexpected Morning Music. When I picture this scene, Segovia, I imagine the pirates topping a rise to see a moderate town at the bottom of the hill. A town with a wall surrounding it, but more of a fence than a proper fortification, although made of stone. Segovia lies in a valley. I picture it kind of like an amphitheater with a river running through the center. The hill on which the pirates were standing stood in front of the town. On either side there were 2 larger pine-covered hills, and then behind the city, a mountain range. The mountain range is where the pirates were headed, but before they could get there, those 2 pine-covered hills on either side of the town just happened to have excellent lines of sight on the approach to Segovia. The pirates knew that the approach to the city would be difficult. They knew that they would be fired upon from within that pine tree cover. As soon as they started their descent, a volley of musket shot fired on them. It wasn't a devastating salvo, but it did hit 2 men. However, the pirates were prepared for this. Each of their 5 separate divisions had a sector to watch, an area of ground and tree cover that they were to keep an eye on. They had orders to open up on any location from where shots were fired, which wasn't tremendously difficult. Old-fashioned muskets tend to produce a lot of smoke. So the pirates were able to fire roughly on the location from where they were being shot, and that forced the Spanish to move before they could open fire again. This pattern continued for nearly an hour of a slow, moving firefight, but eventually the pirates reached Segovia proper. Now, last time I told you the pirates were crossing through Costa Rica, and that's what Revenant de Lucan tells us over and over again. But that should serve as an excellent lesson in why we should never trust scurvy, lying pirates, or old historical sources. The pirates weren't in Costa Rica at all, so sorry about that. The coast of Central America, the Pacific coast of Central America, was called Costa Rica at the time, but the pirates were in fact in northwest Nicaragua, very near the border with Honduras. I should have picked up on that much earlier, such as when the pirates took that small town called Coluteca in Honduras, or when the pirates scuttled their ships in the Gulf of Fonseca on the coast of Nicaragua. This whole region, Nueva Segovia, was lightly populated by the Spanish in 1688. There were a ton of Nicaraguan natives living there, but the city itself, Segovia, was only there because of the gold deposits that were found in the Coluteca River that ran near town. Today, the city of Nueva Segovia is called Ocotal, which is a native Nicaraguan name for the region. But if you take a look at this region on a map, you'll notice a few things. The first thing I noticed is that these pirates' route across Nicaragua ran somewhat parallel to Henry Morgan's route some 22 years earlier. They were to the north of Grenada and Lake Nicaragua. But looking at that map, we can guess the trajectory of these pirates. When we look at where they made landfall and where they are now, at Segovia, it looks very much like they're headed for Cabo Gracias a Dios. You may remember that location in northeast Nicaragua. It's the very same place that another French buccaneer, maybe the forefather of these pirates, a place where he met his grisly end as the main course for a group of cannibals. Francois L'Olonnais was executed and then eaten for his crimes against the native peoples in the region into which these pirates were headed. And you might be wondering, well, then where are all of these native peoples? Well, there weren't many of them in Segovia, a Spanish stronghold, but they are going to play a role. These buccaneers weren't much more sensitive than L'Olonnais had been. But back to Segovia. Pierre de Picard and Mathurin de Moray expected stout resistance when they arrived at the town. They expected barricades and pike formations and snipers in every window. They expected cannons and cavalry units, everything that it would take to defend this city. Ravenel de Lussan tells us of Segovia, quote, "This town lies in a bottom, and is so surrounded with mountains that she looks as if she were laid up in prison. The churches are here but very indifferently built, and the place of arms is both considerable and very fine." End quote. It was a city, a rich, gold-rich city, with fine architecture, even if he says they are indifferently built, exactly the sort of place that the Spanish traditionally would pull out all the stops to defend. But there wasn't an attack when the pirates came into town. There were no barricades, there were no pike formations, there weren't cannons or horses, there was nothing. The city appeared very much to be empty. The only person that the pirates saw was one old man that the pirates very nearly stumbled over. Segovia had been abandoned. However, even though all of the people were gone, their food and drink was not gone, as it had been everywhere else. There were plenty of supplies there in town, on which the pirates, the hungry pirates, could have feasted. Not only was there food, there was ale and wine and rum, and even a good bit of treasure lying around. That's kind of a pirate dream. Nobody to try and kill them, but plenty of gold and silver. They could build a few roaring fires and roast some pork and duckling and wash it all down with a fine Spanish wine. I mean, really, that's kind of my dream, too. As the pirates passed through town, they saw these goods and this food through nearly every window. A few of the pirates wanted to go indulge. It was all inviting, after all. I mean, all that was missing were a few willing ladies to pass the time. But what do you imagine would have happened if the pirates had, in fact, indulged? The pirates would split up to go find treasure in every corner of town, and sure, they would be careful with their guns primed, waiting for an ambush. But then they would come across their stores of gold and jewels, and of course they would take that because they're pirates. But that would take up room in their packs, room that was currently occupied by shot and powder. And no attack would come. The pirates were just so terrifying, the Spanish couldn't even face them. And once they were feeling all safe and secure and rich, they would build those fires, they would eat those feasts, and they would toast over and over again the cowardice of the Spanish dogs who left all of this behind. Frankly, I'm a bit surprised that the Spanish didn't accidentally leave a few of the pretty native girls and slaves behind. You know, purely by accident. Just overlooked the half-dressed young women lying invitingly on piles of silver. Oops. Luzon and the commanders of the pirates figured out pretty quickly that there was a plan in place here, a trap into which the pirates were meant to fall. Lull them into security, fill them with drink and food, and let them drift away by the fire. That's when you send in a few hundred troops to execute them. So the commanders gave orders not to leave the column. They reprimanded any man who thought about slipping away to fill his pockets, and they did so harshly. Remember, pirate discipline was a delicate thing. But the pirates marched through Segovia without breaking ranks, even if there was a fair amount of grumbling. And I can understand that grumbling. Who would want to leave all of that behind when they were faced with sheer, steep mountains? Luzon writes, quote, "The way is very difficult, being mountains of a prodigious height, to the tops whereof we must creep with great danger. The valleys, consequently, are so narrow here that for a league of even ground you have 6 leagues of mountains to go. We felt a very sharp cold, and were taken with so thick a fog that even when day appeared we could not know one another otherwise than by our voices. That lasted till 10 in the morning, when the weather cleared up and the fog went entirely off, and the heat becomes very great. Thus we were forced to endure such contrary seasons, but the hopes of getting once into our native country made us endure all these toils and served as wings to carry us." End quote. The mountains were daunting and unpleasant compared to what Segovia offered, but the commanders got their men moving regardless, which was, considering what waited them, probably a very good thing. And they gained a march on the Spanish, which was the pirates' goal, but the Spanish were ready for that too. Upon entering the mountains, they faced a barricade of tree trunks that blocked their passage through the valley, and that took the better part of a day to break through. This gave the Spanish plenty of time to send a company ahead to cut off the pirates and begin making mischief. Come nightfall, the pirates made camp at a hato there in the valley, at the foot of a very tall mountain, the first real mountain they'd encountered. The Spanish fired into the camp throughout the night, so the pirates had to dig little trenches to sleep in, and they slept without fire, but even still, during the night a few pirates were hit. The following day, the pirates made their first ascent, their first real climb, and it was slow going. There was the climbing, but they also spotted a herd of wild horses, which they spent time to hunt. But eventually they came to an eminence, a large flat spot near the top of a mountain. It was defensible against the Spanish, which was good, but it also gave them some much-needed intel. Unfortunately, the intelligence was not good. There was a valley in front of them, and then, climbing the next rise, there were Spanish emplacements. Quote, "On the 13th, an hour before sunrising, we mounted along an eminence that seemed to us to be an advantageous place to encamp on. From thence we sat upon the edge of a mountain. We sent 40 men hither, who had observed 3 retrenchments in the same place, all about pistol shot from one another, which rising by degrees towards the middle of the same side of the mountain, fully barricaded the way through which we were to pass next day, and commanded a small stream that ran along the said valley, into which we must necessarily descend first, there being no other way. 10,000 men could not force their way through that entrenchment without being cut to pieces, as well because of the advantage of the place as the number of Spaniards that defended it. They saw also a man who, as soon as he saw them, severely threatened them with his cutlass, which he held naked in his hand." End quote. Now, I don't know that I believe 10,000 men would be unable to take it, but it's not impossible. The pirates despaired. Lucan continues, quote, "These sad tidings were a mighty allay to our joy. But these thoughts were at once to be laid aside, to make room for to consider how we should disentangle ourselves from that place without delay, because the Spaniards who were gathering together from all adjacent provinces would quickly fall upon our small company." End quote. The Spanish had a well-defended entrenchment, looking downhill as the pirates would be coming up. It was complete with barricades and ditches that would leave anyone trying to climb the mountain open to attack, and there were hundreds of soldiers waiting for them, and more were arriving every day in alarmingly large numbers. There was no way to pass around it. There was a sheer cliff on one side, a stream, and a dense wood on the other. And even if they did manage to get the entire pirate army around the Spanish, what then? There would still be a Spanish army on their tail, growing larger every day. Lucan writes, quote, "And though, after all, we should have found out a way to escape across so many obstacles, there was still an indispensable necessity that we should fight with the Spaniards, that we might be at quiet for the rest of our journey." End quote. Once the pirates recovered from their despair, most of them were for making a stand here, for fighting it out with the Spanish in a final bid to decide their fate. Lucan describes the admittedly brave, if foolish, French buccaneers falling into despair, but finding resolve in this last, desperate act of defiance against the Spanish. And that sort of thing, well, it's almost a heroic cliché. You know, the charge of the Light Brigade, the 300 Spartans holding the Persians back at the Battle of Thermopylae, or Helm's Deep. You know, if this is to be our end, then I would have them make such an end as to be worthy of remembrance. But if that's the way this were to go, I wouldn't be telling this story. This story would not be remembered beyond a few soldiers doing their job. Lucan and Picard and Desmarais and all of the rest of the pirates would have died here, and we would know virtually nothing of their exploits after Guayaquil, except as maybe a footnote in some dusty Spanish record book. And the Spanish did keep good records, but there's no story there, just here's some pirates and here they died. Happily for us, though, that's not how this story went. Lucan tells us that it was his input that changed the men's minds, an impassioned speech to put some steel in their bellies, that kind of thing. But I think it would be better described, if it were even in fact Lucan who did so, as talking sense into the pirates. How about, rather than charge into a hail of deadly musket shot which will kill us all, how about we at least give sneaking around them a try? Not all of us, and we might all die in the end anyway, but how would that be different from one last glorious charge? Except in that we might not all die. If we're lucky here, we might be able to sneak some men past the Spanish and fall on them unexpectedly from behind. Quote, "I told them that, for my part, I could not see what else we could do but go cross those woods, precipices, mountains, and rocks, how inaccessible soever they appeared to be, and endeavor to surprise the enemy in the rear, and to gain the advantage of ground from them by getting above them, where surely we were not expected, and that I would answer for the success of the same at the peril of my life, if they would undertake it." End quote. Which speaks to the character of Lucan, both in the sense of, moral righteousness, Calvin's dad telling him that shoveling the walkway builds character, but also in the characterization of Revenant de Lucan. Whether or not it's true, it's a compelling image of him before the rest of his French compatriots, telling them that there is a chance, if only they have the courage to grasp it, to sneak through those dark and dangerous woods to fall upon the Spanish from behind, and he claiming that he will go himself at the peril of his own life if the men would agree to do so. However, before any of that could begin, the pirates had to deal with their dead weight. They had a ton of horses, they had a bunch of prisoners, and then they had all of those freed slaves that didn't have any guns. First, they sent the prisoners away, back to town, theoretically, although really into the waiting arms of a Spanish army. More important, though, were the freed men, who were unarmed. They gave them pistols and swords, and set those former slaves to guarding the horses. There were a few pirates among them, mostly Englishmen, or at least those who spoke enough English to give orders to the freedmen, including George Dew. And with that, everyone appeared to be ready to settle down for the evening. The Spanish probably assumed that that's what the pirates were doing, which, in a way, it was. But it was a tense night for the pirates. A few pirates, their best scouts, those who had excellent eyesight, slipped into the trees as silently as possible to scout out a path. They had to navigate only by the scant amount of moonlight that filtered through the trees, and in doing so they had to be very, very quiet to avoid being detected by the Spanish. And make no mistake, the Spanish were watching the trees. If they heard voices or a suspicious amount of activity, they would investigate. Now, this might be a bit more personal information than you'd care for, but I was reminded of something while reading about this. I once stalked a girlfriend of mine through the woods. It was, on a camping trip. It's not as creepy as I made that sound. But I did so at night, and it was kind of scary. I mean, bears are a thing, possums are a thing, and I hate possums. It was really hard to find her. And she wanted me to find her. But that wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part was once I figured out where she was, sneaking around her so that I could sneak up on her from behind, quietly enough to actually surprise her, which was the goal. And at the end of all of that, I did not have a reasonable expectation of having hot lead tear through my flesh, leaving me to bleed out until one of those bears, or maybe a family of possums, shows up to finish the job. I mean, I can only imagine the sort of tension that was coursing through the veins of the pirates, the fear and adrenaline and the sound of blood pumping in their ears. This was the moment, and these scouts were the men on which their success and return home, or their failure and certain death, relied. But Lucan was among those who made their way through the woods, and eventually they had good news. Quote, "Scarce had we considered the ascent where the Spaniards had made their retrenchments, but above them we saw a road, which we could not discover but with difficulty, and by lights peeping between the trees, which would allow us to see but some traces at a distance from one another." End quote. He's saying that through these dark, dense, and dangerous woods, there was a road above the Spanish that, if the pirates were able to reach, would give them an excellent vantage on the Spanish from the rear. So the pirates began sending troops. Lucan continues, quote, "We sent 20 men to cover another party, whom we knew by experience to be ingenious and expert upon several occasions, that so they might pitch upon those places by which we might, in the night, the more easily get up as far as that road, thereby to go and charge the enemy in the rear by break of day." End quote. Lucan is saying that they sent scouts ahead, aside from one man who was to report, so that they could guide and guard more and more troops as they passed through the woods in the evening. They traveled in parties of about 20 men, quickly and quietly. And I do wonder how they hid their diminishing numbers, but apparently the Spanish didn't suspect a thing. After a long night of trying to sneak pirates through the woods, they were split up into 3 main bodies. There were those that were guarding the horses in the far rear, and that was not a safe position. The Spanish had 300 soldiers behind the main body of pirates, what Luzon calls, quote, our constant shadow. Those were 300 men menacing the 80 or so untrained slaves with only a few experienced pirates to back them up. And I don't intend to sully the bravery or the valor of those former slaves. They're about to prove they have both in truly spectacular fashion. But slave masters were rarely inclined to train their property to kill people. Never a good idea in their position. And then there was the main body of pirates, about 200 or so strong. They were waiting before the Spanish entrenchment. But then finally there were about 120 crack shots that were moving into place above and behind the Spanish, their best and brightest, you might say. Luzon describes their movements, quote, "Things being thus disposed, we said our prayers as low as we could, that the Spaniards might not hear us. At the same time we set forward by moonlight. We heard the Spaniards also at their prayers, who fired 600 muskets into the air to frighten us. They also discharged at the responses of the litany of the saints which they sung. We still pursued our march, and spent the whole night to advance the distance between them and us, through a country so full of rocks, mountains, and frightful precipices that our posteriors were of more use to us than our legs." End quote. As dawn broke, the pirates were almost in position. Happily, though, despite the sun being up, they still had that heavy fog to hide their movements, which put the Spanish at a big disadvantage. See, the Spanish didn't know that anyone was up there, so they talked and rummaged around like normal. That made noise that gave the pirates every opportunity to get into position. The pirates knew where the Spanish were, while the Spanish didn't know where the pirates were. But one group of 5 or 6 pirates happened upon a pair of Spanish sentinels in the fog. They were standing very quietly and difficult to see until you were right up on them. Everyone was surprised, the sentinels, the pirates, and everyone fired. The game was up. The Spanish knew something was up there, something had fired off their guns, and they got in place to do battle. But there was confusion in the Spanish camp. The shots came from above, but there were echoes in the valley, and the fog muffled noise. Arguments broke out among the Spanish. They're above us. No, they're below us. In fact, they were both. But the Spanish broke their ranks of 500 to face both up and downhill. And that's exactly what they should have done in this situation, but a volley came at them, not from above, but from below, from the pirates waiting below them. So all of the Spanish turned to face that direction. And that's exactly what they should not have done. Luzon says, quote, "The Spaniards, who thought of nothing less than to see us come down from above upon their retrenchment, about 500 men, consequently open without any cover, took the alarm so hot that falling all upon them at the same time, we made them quit the place in a moment, and make their escape by the favor of the fog. This unexpected morning music disturbed the economy of their designs, and so thwarted their whole contrivance." End quote. When the Spanish turned to face downhill, the pirates above fell on them and fired on them. The Spanish, having been hit so hard and so fast, broke ranks and ran. They abandoned their highest entrenchment, which allowed the pirates to capture it, which gave them ample opportunity to fire on the Spanish. It put the Spanish in the very same disadvantage that the pirates had been in only a few hours before. The pirates, now in place, opened fire, and kept up fire for an hour, but they had to do so through the fog that was still there. After that hour was up, the Spanish were still in place. They had not moved. It appeared that their muskets were unable to reach the Spanish, or at least do so with any hope of hitting them. So instead, the pirates drew their cutlasses and their pistols and advanced downhill through the fog. Quietly, as quietly as possible so to go unnoticed, until they were right on the second barricade. The pirates rushed forward, slashing at anyone in their way. The front ranks fell. When they engaged, pistols were discharged and dropped just like the Spanish. Men were screaming and dying. Quote, "We fought them stoutly, and they did not quit the place till such time as they saw the butts of our muskets. But then, being much terrified, they left us all and ran that way which was before their retrenchments." End quote. The Spanish broke and ran again, only this time they ran right into a barricade of fallen trees that they had put in place on the road to stop the pirates from advancing. That stopped them from continuing their retreat. That allowed the pirates above to fire on them, while simultaneously those below had a clear shot. Luzon writes, quote, "Thus the precaution which they had taken against us was turned upon themselves, insomuch that we had so clear a view of them from the retrenchments we had taken that we did execution almost with every piece we shot." End quote. They did execution with every piece they shot. The Spanish were caught in a crossfire, and they were being slaughtered. Within the hour, they broke and ran into the trees or into the hills or down the cliffside, anywhere that hot iron was not flying through the air. This was their final flight. They had lost the battle. And it was a brutal fight, even by pirate standards. Even those pirates with the darkest reputations were still products of their times. Usually they fought with, well, I was going to say honor, but honor isn't the right word. They at least followed some of the rules of engagement. When quarter was asked, it was given. Usually. Quote, "We found these Spaniards had so little mind to give us quarter that even when we took any of them, they would not as much as ask it at our hands, though they did all they could to save themselves out of our hands. At this no man ought to wonder, for it's a maxim amongst them in these parts, whether it proceed from pride or fierceness of temper, that they will never ask quarter of those to whom they would give none. But we, in the meantime, being affected with compassion upon sight of the great quantity of blood we saw running down into the rivulet, spared the rest, and went a second time into our entrenchments, having lost all this, while but one man, and only 2 wounded." End quote. What he's saying there is that the pirates attempted to take prisoners, but the Spanish refused to accept quarter or ask it. So anywhere that the pirates came upon a Spaniard or a small group of them, they killed them. Eventually, in sympathy at the large number of Spanish left dead on the field, the pirates pulled back and allowed the Spanish to flee. With the battle over and the Spanish broken, we might assume that the pirates had clear sailing ahead of them, all the way to the coast. However, the battles were not yet done, and there were still leagues and leagues ahead of them that were filled with warring Native American tribes. When we left off last time, the French buccaneers, led by Pierre Le Picard and Mathurin des Marais, had just dealt a staggering defeat to the Spanish soldiers that had been harrying them. We're picking up right where we left off, in the immediate aftermath of the battle. This episode could have been titled Unexpected Morning Music, Part 2. However, that music in question was very much expected today, and I found another title I wanted to use. This is episode 143, Men or Devils. Once the Spanish finally fled the field of battle, after the pirates had defeated them, they left their dead and wounded behind, those too wounded to walk, and the buccaneers combed through the battlefield for, well, anything of interest. Good boots or shot and powder, maybe coats, muskets maybe, but the Spanish guns weren't that good. In combing the field, though, they happened across the Spanish general. Ravenel de Luzon calls him an old Walloon, that is, a one-time soldier in the Wallonia region of Belgium, something we might know better as the Spanish Netherlands. It's a predominantly French-speaking region today, and in fact at the time had a lot of French speakers. However, it was occupied by Spain. That occupation was a bone of contention between Spain and France for many, many years. It was something of an open wound between the two nations that made any sort of lasting peace impossible. It reminds me of Alsace and Lorraine between France and Germany. To the French, any Frenchman really, finding an old Walloon commander would not be unlike a Frenchman finding an old German commander of Alsace and Lorraine in World War I, or maybe a Chinese soldier discovering that the Japanese general that they had just captured had taken part in the rape of Nanking. There are 1,000 stories like that all throughout history, all around the world, of ancient enmity that manifests itself in the people of their time. It might be a bit much to say that the pirates celebrated the death of this old Walloon, but I imagine that his corpse was the target of many a French curse and many a Frenchman's spit. Lussan tells us, quote, "Their general, an old Walloon officer, had given them the plan of this retrenchment that would infallibly have prevailed against us had we attacked them by the way they expected. Another old captain advised him to secure their rear, but the general saw so little likelihood of danger on that side that he answered we, the pirates, must be either men or devils. If we were men, he defied us to get over any way. If we were devils, he must be taken." End quote. However, that other old captain eventually prevailed with their general and convinced him to post those 2 sentries that the pirates stumbled upon, those who alerted the Spanish to the pirate movements above them. Now, that did not do much for the Spanish in the end, but it was the right move. Throughout this entire post-battle sequence, Lussan is, if any of it can actually be believed, Lussan is castigating the general for his failure, and considering the death toll on the side of the Spanish, the general does seem to deserve it. And there's, kind of a lot of nationalistic chest thumping going on. Oh, the French are so much braver than the Spanish, blah, 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 but I think there's a real lesson to take from this story. The pirates, and really pirates in general, teach us a lesson. It's a lesson that you can really see best in hindsight, and honestly, it's a lesson that most people in the world have learned by this point. But it's something that the powers of Europe wouldn't learn until maybe the French Revolution or Napoleon, or in some cases even World War I. The pirates, when we take away the crime, which maybe we should not do since it's the definition of piracy, but when we take away the crime and the rum and the eye patches and the parrots and the politics and religion, all we're really left with is the job of piracy. A pirate crew was essentially an independent mercenary Marine Corps. Now, they were different from other mercenary navies, legitimate, legal mercenary navies, in that they had a decentralized structure. There was an admiral from time to time, but it was really on a ship-by-ship basis. But the thing that separates pirates from royal or national navies and armies is something that we recognize as deeply important, but was not necessarily recognized at the time. It's the question of merit. Pirates utilized their merit-based system in their command structure. If a captain was bad at his job, the pirates under him, through thoroughly democratic means, had the ability to replace that captain, or that quartermaster, or whatever officer was failing to do their duty. They could be voted out of power and replaced with someone who would hopefully do a better job. And that didn't always work out. Just like modern Republican democracies don't always work out. Sometimes you elect an Adolf Hitler, but they work out more often than not. When men of the Royal Navy, or soldiers in a continental army or even a Spanish colonial militia in the New World, when they were led by incompetent commanders who usually had a name that carried some influence, when those soldiers or sailors thought about replacing their commander or, God forbid, discussed replacing their commander, they were beaten or even executed, usually on the direct orders of that same incompetent commander. There was no merit-based system in any of those organizations. It was all about the name. It was all about the money and the power that you held, not how good you were at the job. And this is a military question, although there are obvious parallels to politics. But in military organizations, that system often led to disasters very much like the one that the Spanish had just endured here. There was a tiny force, a fraction of the size of the Spanish force in the region, that had severe tactical disadvantages, and they were able to outsmart and overwhelm the clearly superior force because they had better commanders. These were lions led by donkeys versus lions led by better lions. Now, all of this clearly is fed by my own modern biases, I won't deny that, but it is corroborated in Lussan's account. In fact, he kind of pushes that idea. More than anything, he does so via a letter that he claims was found on the person of that Walloon commander. A letter to the commander from the general of this region, which Lussan reprints in full. I'm not going to bother you by reading the whole thing, but I am going to select the very best bits that, support my point of view. That letter, according to Lussan, reads, quote, "A letter written by the general of the province of Costa Rica to the commander in the retrenchments, dated January 6th, 1688. Sir, I thought I had made a good choice when I committed to you the conduct of an affair which ought to re-establish our reputation, if you have the better of the enemy. I was preparing to send you 8,000 men, if you had not sent me word that 1,500 was enough. I doubt not a person that hath served so long as you have done will take care of your men. According to the relation you have given of your retrenchments, it's impossible but those people, with the help of God, must be destroyed." End quote. I want to pause and point out that the general could have had 8,000 soldiers to attack the pirates. And yeah, that probably does sound like overkill for 300 scurvy French pirates, but clearly they needed it. And why would he turn down that clear advantage? Pride is the only answer that comes to mind. But then the governor goes on to advise some troop movements to the general, and the commander followed some of them, but not all of them. However, the letter continues, quote, "Take good measures, for those devils have a cunning and subtlety that is not in use amongst us. When you find them within the shot of your harquebuses, and when you find them weakened, raise a shout to frighten them and fall in with your swords, while Don Rodrigo attacks them in the rear." End quote. Which you might note is not what the Spanish commander did, but it is what the pirates did in their same situation. Don Rodrigo, by the way, was the commander of those 300 soldiers to the pirates' rear, closer to Segovia, their constant shadow, as Lussan calls them, and we should not forget about them. But the governor goes on to conclude his letter with a bunch of talk about God and his divine preference of the Spanish over what he calls these new sort of Turks, and the governor even goes on to make promises of heavenly rewards and the more earthly rewards of gold and silver that would be claimed from the corpses of the pirates. And Lussan is really kind of smirking about that. He retorts that bit of Spanish religiosity by describing the French pirates singing, quote, "Te Deum upon the field of battle, by way of thanks unto God for this victory." End quote. Which is a very fancy, very Catholic, very old world way of saying, nah, 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 nah. However, the pirates did not have a long time to celebrate their victory. That shadow company, their constant shadow, was still in the rear, and before long, the pirates, puttering around the field of battle, heard musket fire coming from around the mountain. Now, remember how the battle was organized here. The pirates held the high ground, and the Spanish were stuck below them at one of their own barricades. There was another company of pirates that held the valley below the Spanish, and then there was the pirate baggage train, guarded by a force of mostly freed slaves that was around a bend in the river. Behind them, there were those 300 Spaniards. Neither the pirates' baggage train nor those 300 Spanish troops could see or knew what was happening in the battle. Now, had those 300 soldiers known what was happening up the mountain, they may have pulled back to a better, more defensible position. But that's not what happened. Instead, when the Constant Shadow heard the guns of the battle dying down, they presumed that the battle had been won by their Spanish brethren, and they advanced on the pirates' baggage train. They didn't want all of their clearly victorious compatriots to hog all the glory, after all. That's when the pirates up the mountain, who had just fought a battle, heard the guns. Now that middle group of pirates, those stuck below the Spanish, they put 60 men on Spanish horses, and those 60 rushed off to the fighting in the rear. But the gunfire only lasted for a few minutes. The pirates on horseback assumed that the Spanish had taken that battlefield and thought that they would have to fight another battle before the day was out. But let's assume that you had been bought and sold as property. Here, in this moment, in Central America, you have a chance at real freedom, and there were 300 Spaniards trying to take that away from you. What would you do to escape that fate? What wouldn't you do to escape that fate? To defend yourself and the other 80 freed men and women and children who were there beside you, all in the same dire situation. They did what I assume anyone would do. They fought really, really hard. Now, Lusan wasn't there, but he did hear about what transpired when the guns ceased fire. He says, quote, "Considering their number, the Spanish could have carried an emolument. They had so little courage that they contented themselves to send an officer to our men that guarded the baggage to parley with them, and thus the cowardice of the enemy was fully confirmed." End quote. The Spanish had advanced on the baggage train, but they were fought back, and they retreated to an eminence where they entrenched themselves, a highly defensible position. It was then, before the 60 cavalrymen arrived, that they sent down an emissary to discuss terms. And that emissary believed that he was doing so from a position of strength. They might have pulled back from the fight, but they had the rear well defended here. They had a very defensible position. There was no escape through them, and really, he was right, there wasn't an escape that way. But that emissary was operating under the assumption that there were still soldiers who were pinning the pirates in on the other side, those soldiers that the pirates had just routed. He gave the pirates terms. He suggested that they hand over their rightful Spanish property. He wanted the treasure and the slaves, but in return, he offered safe passage. The emissary told the pirates, quote, "I come hither from my general. You say that you are men of courage, yet you are not to doubt the great numbers of men we have will overpower you. If you will give yourselves up prisoners of war into the power of our general," who was dead, remember, "who is a man of honor, we will be friends and let you pass to your own country." End quote. This message made everyone in the pirates' rear guard very nervous. Remember that they didn't know what had happened in the battle any more than this Spanish emissary did. Some of them began to think that it might be in their best interest to surrender. If the Spanish were really men of their word, that might get them home alive. Obviously, though, the freed slaves did not share that opinion. They were not about to go back in chains, and they still had all of those weapons that had been given to them by the pirates. There was a moment there where it almost fell into fighting between the pirates and their allies. There were a lot of glances passed between men. There was a lot of gripping the hilts and the pistols tightly. And considering the numbers at play in this rearguard, the slaves very much could have killed the few pirates. They could have killed them to a man. And then the slaves, once again slaves, could have been swept up by the Spanish with ease. At this moment, disaster was inches away. Right then, when everything rested on a knife's edge, a horse's whinny was heard in the distance. That was followed by the sound of galloping hooves. If the former slaves and the pirates in the rear guard were about to fight one another, they put that aside to defend against whatever was coming up behind them. However, they saw that the reinforcements had arrived on the back of Spanish horses. The rearguard's courage was restored, and they told that Spanish emissary, quote, "Though you have force enough to destroy our number, we should not fail still to fight. Yea, though there were but one man of us left, he should fight still against you all. When we left the sea, we resolved to pass through your country or die in the attempt, and though there were as many Spaniards of you as there is grass in this savannah, we should not be afraid, but look upon you always, in our opinion, cowards, and we will pass on, and go where we will in spite of your teeth." End quote. That's a bold speech. However, those pirates probably felt confident in making that speech. They probably realized what the Spanish emissary had just realized. Quote, "The officer, being dismissed upon our arrival, mounted his horse to return from whence he came. Observing we were booted and mounted upon his companions' horses, he shrunk up his shoulders by way of amazement, and rode as fast as he could to carry the news to his own party. As soon as he was got to them, we advanced and fell upon them. We received their first firing, to which we made return with our pistols and cutlasses, and that unhappily for them who had not yet got upon their horses, for we cut a great many of them to pieces. We let the rest go, detaining only their horses, when we had broken all their arms. We had no more than one man killed in this engagement, as 'twas in the other, and 2 maimed." End quote. Now I know I've said it before, but I have to say it again. I adore the writing of Raveneau de Lussan. I don't care if it's a half-true fable that was unduly influenced by his publishers back in France. That is a hell of a story. And I mean, I shouldn't be surprised at that. This was the reign of Louis XIV, which is considered by some the pinnacle of French literature, and that makes it a contender for the height of European or even world literature, at least before the 20th century. No, I don't know that I would agree with that, but I don't speak French and I'm not a literary scholar. I do love this book, at the very least. Now they let those Spanish who were still in one piece run away, but they kept their horses, and when he says they broke their arms, he means their guns. They didn't literally break their arms. Another battle had been won with shocking lack of casualties against the Spanish. That's 2 forces defeated by an inferior number of pirates. However, those of you who are paying close attention might have noticed something. Remember, in that letter that the governor sent, he said that the general only required 1,500 men. The pirates had defeated a force of maybe as many as 500 earlier in the day, most of whom they let escape. Then they defeated another force of maybe 300 men, most of whom they let escape. That is only, at the very most, 800 men, most of whom escaped. What about the other 700? Well, they were dug in deep, high up on the mountainside. Lussan tells us that, come nightfall, the pirates saw a massive bonfire far above them. It was the sort of fire that nobody in the valley could miss, not the pirates, who were certainly meant to see it, and not what he calls the fugitives. Those hundreds of soldiers that they had let escape, that they had failed to kill, well, they were heading to that bonfire like moths to a flame. They were rejoining the ranks of those 7 or 8 or more hundred Spanish soldiers. That was a force that was not split up. That was a force that they would be unlikely to defeat. The pirates did not wait for those Spanish forces to gather and fall on them. They began making moves immediately. They did not make camp that night. There was no rest for the wicked. This was their only window that they had, and they had work to do. This is kind of a disturbing bit of information, honestly. It makes sense. It's the sort of thing that we see fairly often in world history. We even see it twice in the Bible. But if you're squeamish or a particularly strong animal lover, you might want to close your ears for a moment. The pirates there in the river valley found themselves in possession of every Spanish horse. Those horses, when the Spanish came down the mountain, would allow them to chase after the pirates at speed. The Spanish were relying on them to catch the pirates. So the pirates hamstrung them. 900 horses, all throughout the night for hours, had their hamstrings sliced with swords. Now, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that sounds like. I don't know what that smells like, and to be honest, I don't want to know. I'm not going to dwell on that event. But for the pirates to escape, it makes sense. It would slow the Spanish down, while the pirates took around 300 horses at dawn and rode away at speed. They rode hard for several days, through the river valley at the base of the mountain. On the 15th, they came to a hato that had a few Spanish ranchers staying there. Now, those ranchers were surprised and a bit frightened at the sudden appearance of 300 French buccaneers. But the buccaneers didn't want to attack them. They wanted their help. The ranchers, probably with the threat of death hanging over their heads, aided the pirates in slaughtering and salting 200 of their horses. They were to feed the pirates for the rest of their journey home. 100 of those horses, though, were left with the ranchers as a sort of repayment, something I imagine that those ranchers never mentioned to anybody. The following morning, with no sign of the Spanish on their trail, the pirates found a suitable place to put in on the river. Thus far it hadn't been wide enough or deep enough to carry them, but here, on the 17th of January, they found the place where it really began to flow. Now, the pirates didn't have boats, but they did have axes. Lucan writes, quote, "On the 17th we came to the river, and entered the woods that grow upon the banks, where everyone fell to work in good earnest to cut down trees to build piperies. Some perhaps may think that these were commodious vessels, to carry us with ease down the river, but there was nothing less than that in it." End quote. Piperies were nothing more than rafts, just a few logs that were strapped together on which 2 or maybe 3 pirates could stand to row downriver. You've seen people paddle boarding, maybe you've been paddle boarding yourself. Well, this looked a lot like that, only people on paddle boards are usually far more attractive. Paddleboarders also usually aren't carrying rucksacks that have all of their worldly wealth in them. They also aren't carrying black powder muskets, which might save their lives and would be rendered completely useless if they should get too wet. But their entry into this river finally tells us where the pirates were headed, conclusively. Today, that river is called the Rio Coco, but at the time, the Spanish called her the Rio Segovia. She begins before Segovia, but she lets out on the other side of the continent, in the Caribbean, at Cabo Gracias a Dios. However, that river, Rio Coco or Rio Segovia, it has another name. It is called the Wonky River. It's given that name by the people who commanded the southern Nicaraguan bank of the river and controlled most of Nicaragua all the way to the coast, the Mosquito Coast. Next time, well, Ravno de Lusan can do a better job telling you about next time than I can. He writes, quote, "You may judge by what follows whether the continual apprehensions of danger we were in were well or ill-grounded." End quote. This is the conclusion to the tale of Ravno de Lusan. Now, many of the characters in his story will pop up elsewhere, Lusan himself once or twice, but the story of his narrative, the story in which Lusan is the central character, is coming to an end today. When we left off last time, the Buccaneers had just defeated an overwhelming Spanish force, but they'd left more than 1,000 other Spanish troops in their wake. The pirates fled downriver, praying that their flight would carry them from any further battles, or at least battles with the Spanish. They knew full well that there were plenty of Native American groups out there, some of whom would be hostile. Lusan himself said, upon their departure, to the reader, quote, "You may judge by what follows whether the continual apprehensions of danger we were in were well or ill-grounded." End quote. This is episode 144, Well-Grounded. There were two prominent groups of indigenous peoples in the region. We'll get to the second in a minute, but the first were the Mosquito people. Now, you may be thinking that that's excellent news. I mean, the Mosquito and the pirates had wonderful relations, right? And that's true, but not applicable here. The Mosquito had good relations with the Dutch Zee rovers. They had ever since Abraham Blauvelt had founded Abraham's Key at Bluefields, and the Mosquito were on very good terms with the English out of Jamaica. That goes all the way back to 1631. The Providence Island Company began those relations, but they were strengthened by Henry Morgan, and then successive waves of Port Royal buccaneers made those relations even better. English pirates who were sailing to the Main almost always had a Mosquito guide on board. That alliance between England and the Mosquito people would be formally recognized by the English crown in 1740. So the Mosquito got along great with the English. They got along fine with the Dutch, but the French... The last memorable dealings that the French pirates had with the people of the Mosquito Coast, that was Francois l'Olonnais, who landed there in 1666 and made such a violent, psychopathic nuisance of himself that the people there at Cabo Gracias a Dios killed him and ate him. And make no mistake here, the Mosquito were a savvy people. They knew the difference between all of the European powers, and they understood the politics between them. They played those politics to their advantage on more than one occasion. And there's this myth about good Indians who never eat people and bad Indians who eat people all the time. And occasionally there is a little evidence to support some of that, but not here. The English would have had you believe that these allies were the latter sort, but it was almost certainly the Mosquito people that killed Francois l'Olonnais and his fellow commanders. Now, whether or not they really ate him is up for debate. That's just what Alexander Exquemelin tells us. But l'Olonnais was definitely killed there at Cabo Gracias a Dios for his horrific abuses against the Mosquito people. We're talking about torture and rape and murder on a disastrous level. I mention that because that happened only 22 years earlier. Many of the same people that suffered under that French buccaneer's attentions were still alive. Some of them still carried the scars. And when an English admiral, such as Henry Morgan, would arrive with French ships in tow, they were usually able to keep the peace. We're all allies here, at least you are both our allies, so let's not go about killing each other. After all, we're all after the same goal, killing Spanish. And that was often enough. But here, in 1688, there was no English admiral. This was a French buccaneer force, and they were rowing precariously downriver into territory held by the Mosquito, territory that was led by commanders who probably vividly remembered Francois l'Olonnais. But first, before we get to any of that, the pirates need to make their way downriver. They had a small fleet of what they called piperies, which were basically small rafts that held 2 or 3, but usually 2 men standing up. These piperies submerged the pirates to their knees or thighs, or sometimes all the way to the waist, but they allowed them to float well enough. They navigated on these piperies with very long poles. They didn't need oars exactly. The current was quite strong. They didn't need to row, but the poles helped them to avoid the many dangers that the river offered. The Rio Segovia, today the Rio Coco, was a fast-moving whitewater river, and it was filled with danger. Lussan writes, quote, "The river springs in the mountains of Segovia and discharges itself into the North Sea at Cape Gracias a Dios, after having run a very long way, in a most rapid manner, across a vast number of rocks of a prodigious bigness, and by the most frightful precipices that can be thought of, besides a great many falls of water, to the number of at least 100 of all sorts, which it's impossible for a man to look on without trembling, and making the head of the most fearless to turn round when he sees and hears the water fall from such an height into these tremendous whirlpools." End quote. Lussan goes on to tell us that no one who had not seen those frightful precipices and rocks of prodigious bigness, he tells us that no one could begin to believe them had they not seen. And I tend to believe that. I mean, we, in the modern world, have privileges they didn't have back then. We can fly and then drive to get almost anywhere in the world. We can visit unbelievable locations that people in the ancient world would have had almost no hope of seeing. But how many of us would travel for months to go whitewater rafting? To go rafting without helmets, in a place where hitting our head almost certainly meant death. There were no ambulances back then. There was no airlift to the nearest hospital. Rescue crews would be lucky to find anything. Instead, what you had was a filthy rag soaked in wine wrapped around your head. And it would take a lot to convince me to leave hearth and home and good brown beer for something like that. Now, horrific oppression on the one hand and a backpack full of gold on the other, that might just do it. But most people never saw anything like what the pirates had to deal with here. Now, on the first day, the biggest problem was the rocks. A bunch of pirates capsized and had to be rescued. Nearly everyone was soaked by the end of that day, along with their shot and powder, but no one was injured too badly, and no one died. But then came the second day, when the pirates came upon their first waterfall. Those pirates out in the very front heard it first, and a few of them peeled off to the side of the river, but a few were either caught in the current or chose to just keep going. Those pirates went over the waterfall, and those who chose to do so regretted their decision. Most of them wound up gasping and sputtering on the bank of the river, doing so without their packs. All of their food and all of their worldly wealth was now at the bottom of a waterfall. So a few bright souls came up with a solution. They tied their packs and themselves to their piperies and then set out over the waterfall. Those pirates would have regretted their decision had they lived to do so. Every man who tried that little gamble was sucked down and never seen again. Soon enough, every pipery pulled off to the side, onto the bank, and the entire crew was assembled to discuss what to do here. The river was difficult. It was dangerous. Now, they were making incredible time, but they were worn out. The pirates now would have to carry their piperies overland down a hill to put back in the river. It was exhausting. But now that they all agreed they were free of any further Spanish attacks, they came up with a system that would allow some of the men to rest while others moved on. They came up with what was kind of a vaguely military system that broke their fleet into pieces. They broke down essentially by crew. However, within the crew they had smaller subunits that would be spread out so that no large groups of pirates could capsize, bringing everybody down. The crew that was to be out front were kind of a vanguard. You might think of them as scouts. They were going to be subjected to whatever dangers the river might throw their way without any warning whatsoever. Now, that's a dangerous job. Beyond that, that first crew had to get up first thing in the morning and get into the river before everybody else. However, they had the pleasure, those in the vanguard, of pulling out of the river first. They got to take their ease far before everybody else did. And then they got to sleep in the next day. Those who had been in the vanguard, those who had faced the greatest dangers, got to put in last. They got to sleep as long as they wanted before getting back into the river. And then all of the groups of pirates moved forward one level. Those who had been directly behind the vanguard the day before moved up to the vanguard. Those who had been behind them moved up, and so on and so forth. Again, it's Ravno de Lusan who tells us that he alone came up with this strategy, and he had to fight over the objections of the crew to sell it to them, but he did so with his brilliant oratory. Lusan writes, quote, "I advised that those who went down first should take care to set up in the most dangerous places a flag or banner at the top of a long pole, so that we might discern it afar off. Not so much to give notice to those who were hindermost that there was a fall in such a place, for these would make themselves to be heard almost a league off, but to signify to them what side they were to put to land, which would be that where the flag stood. These methods being put in practice saved the lives of a great many men." End quote. So the pirates had a system in place, a system that admittedly did slow them down, but they were so far from the Spanish army by this point that even being spread out in tiny groups that were unable to defend themselves wasn't a huge concern. In fact, it would be almost impossible for the Spanish to catch up with them. The greatest danger they faced during this period was hunger, but that was going to change. Now, they did have all of that horse flesh that they'd salted just a few days earlier, but imagine taking some beef jerky and emptying that into a burlap bag, and then I want you to soak that in river water for a few hours and then eat it. And when I say I want you to do that, please don't do that. That would be very dangerous. The pirates basically lost all of the food they had with them. The vanguard got into the habit of finding and flagging banana groves or groves of other fruit, and for about a week it was a pleasant, peaceful voyage down the river. However, those groves of banana trees started becoming more and more frequent along the river. They became more and more orderly, and once the pirates saw a small structure near the grove. It was clear that they were in inhabited country once again. This stretch of river belonged to indigenous peoples. Two distinct groups. The Mosquito controlled the land from the river to the Mosquito coast, so the southern bank of the river. On the other side, though, we find a people that Ravno de Lusan called the Albaoan nation. The Albaoan people were soon to grip the pirates with a terrible sort of fear. In late January, Ravno de Lusan was in the vanguard, near the front but not at the very front. When we picture the pirates on the river, we need to take a few things into account. First, remember that they were somewhat submerged. They had big poles to push themselves around, but they didn't move very well. That's a large part of the reason they were so split up, so that one fallen pipery wouldn't take down several others. That is to say that they were within earshot of one another, but oftentimes the pirates were not in sight of each other. As Lucan rounded a bend in the river, he saw the telltale signs of an upturned raft. There was a floating pipery in the middle of the river, but no men struggling in the water, nor was there anyone ashore. There were no shouts, there was no sign of life at all. So Lucan and his companion went ashore to investigate, and there they found signs of violence. There were broken tree limbs and disturbed grass and sand and dirt, and there was blood, a lot of blood in one location, followed by 2 separate swaths of blood that led away into the brush. When Lucan and his companion followed those trails of blood, they found exactly what they expected. 2 bodies. In this case they were English, but they were members of the company, and they had their throats slit. Both of their packs were missing, along with all of their worldly wealth, but their swords had gone undrawn. This was a clear assassination. So who were the culprits in all of this? Well, the answer to that was obvious to everyone who saw this scene, Lucan and his companion and those who came after. They were among those Albaoan, quote, savages, end quote, that had been spotted in the hills on the north side of the river. They were now a clear and present menace to the safety and security of the voyage. The following day, the pirates on the river spotted a small group of Albaoan women. They were walking along a ridgeline near the river, carrying fruit on their backs. And some of the pirates got out of the river and went off seeking revenge. At least, it's what they called revenge. Now, Lucan doesn't go into great detail. He wasn't among those that left the river, and even if he had been, he likely wouldn't have written about it. In the very best case scenario here, those women carrying fruit were killed quickly. But it would be naive to believe that the best case scenario is what actually happened. In all likelihood, they suffered greatly before their deaths on pirate sabers. Now, to those of us in the modern world, we can see the injustice in all of that. There is no justice found in killing innocent people. But at the time, there was a sense of, they killed our people, let's kill some of theirs. Some in the pirate company even hailed those who went off to seek that revenge as heroes. They did so a few leagues down the river when those who had gone off to seek that revenge were spotted. They had a banner lifted up to announce their location, and they had a haul of fresh fruit for everybody to enjoy. Over the following days, that very same group of hero pirates slipped off a few more times. They said that they had spotted other Albaoan people lurking about. Not innocent women that they could violate and murder. No, these were very clearly the men that they were hunting. They were dark of countenance and frightful of visage. They had terrible bloody blades by their sides. Sadly, perhaps to be expected though, those hero pirates could never catch those frightful monsters. This was their land, and they knew it better than anyone else. But beyond that, those frightful Albaoan people moved like ghosts. Clearly, they were under the influence of, or perhaps even in league with, Lucifer himself. They had gotten away with murder, and they continued to get away with murder. That group of pirates that went off hunting them over and over again just couldn't catch the villains, and nearly every day more pirates were found dead. They could come from anywhere among the fleet of pirate rafts, not just out front, but in the middle or near the rear. It was a terrifying time when the pirates were prey for those Alboan savages. But Raveneau de Lussan noticed something a bit suspicious here. He appears not only to have been a skilled tactician and a talented orator, but also quite the detective. Do you remember, a couple of episodes back, the little drama surrounding the shares between the pirates? How some in the crew had gambled and lost their winnings to others in the crew. How there was even a plot to kill those who had large sums of money that they had won from others. Raveneau de Lussan remembered that quite well, since his name had been on the hit list. And there was a connection here that was impossible to ignore. Only those pirates who slipped away, remember, pirates who were guilty of rape and murder oh so recently, only they had ever actually seen these vile, terrifying, demonic savages in the hills. And that very same group of pirates, these hero pirates, well, they were well known to have lost all of their winnings in the games. And everyone who had been killed by these assassins, seemingly at random, well, they all happened to be among the biggest winners at the games, those who had well over their given share. Lussan brought up his concerns to the leadership, and the leadership was concerned by this, but they seemed more concerned about how justice was to be exacted. I mean, if what Lussan said was true, the villains had to be killed, justice had to be brought, but in the interest of order and discipline, which were necessary to their survival, those assassins had to be tried and executed in what amounted to a pirate court, not killed by a mob of angry pirates. That could lead to the breakdown of order and the doom of this voyage. The leadership, the captains of the various crews, tried to get their men into order, but it was an impossible task. The crew had the scent of blood now, and they wanted the blood of those who had killed their comrades. However, despite a night of scouring the hills and the camps and the riverbanks, those assassins, those pirates, were nowhere to be found. They had caught wind of the coming storm and slipped away. I wish that there were a satisfying conclusion to this drama, that the pirates had been caught and tried and found guilty, but they were never seen again. If I were writing a fictional version of this story, I would tell maybe of one of the assassins spotted wearing the boots of one of the dead men. But pirates rarely actually wore boots, and these pirates had their feet submerged in water through most of the day. I do like to imagine, though, that those assassins were caught by whoever those indigenous people were, perhaps even by the family of those women that they had attacked and killed, and that they found their justice there. But we don't know what happened to them, and we never will. See, this brings us to what is essentially the end of this leg of the voyage. Shortly after the conclusion of this little drama, in mid-February, the land leveled out. The river had the opportunity to grow wide and calm and free of waterfalls. At that point, all of the French in the fleet decided to stop and build canoes, and that took some time. However, the English still with the company, including George Dew, had a bit of a sour taste in their mouth after so many of them had been targeted by those French assassins. So they went on ahead without canoes but in their piperies. The English went on ahead into Mosquito territory, while the French waited behind because, well, they had canoes to build. It has nothing to do with the fact that the Mosquito might just kill all of us on sight. If the English arrived first, they would have the opportunity to warn the Mosquito that Frenchmen were coming, but that they were friends. And, in the mind of the French, if those negotiations failed and the Mosquito still wanted to kill them, they would have canoes that could carry them quickly and safely to the sea. As it happens, though, shortly after setting out on the 1st of March in their freshly built canoes, the French were stopped by a group of Mosquito scouts. They were sent, they said, by the English buccaneers, by George Dew in particular, probably. The English had arrived safely at the Mosquito Coast, and apparently they were waiting at what was really one of the worst-kept secrets in the West Indies. The Mosquito Coast had a ton of settlements, all the way up from Cabo Gracias a Dios in the north to Abraham's Key at Bluefields in the south. Those two were the largest and best defended holdouts of the lot, and they were key locations in the Mosquito-English alliance. And right now, the English were at Cabo Gracias a Dios, and even more news, they had secured a ship for the French buccaneers. They'd given a deposit to the captain of that vessel, so he would stick around, and the captain had agreed to give 40 pirates a ride wherever they wanted to go, provided they could pay. And that's a smart move for the right kind of captain, the kind of captain who might stop off at Cabo Gracias a Dios. If he were, say, a smuggler who had some legitimate credentials but not too many qualms, they could make a fortune if they stopped off at a known pirate haven and found a crew that needed passage. The Mosquito told the French that they were only to send the 40 that would be going aboard that vessel. However, all 240 of the French buccaneers showed up at Cabo Gracias a Dios only a few days later. The French were back on that fringe of civilization. They had to deal with all of the national tensions that they had left behind when they were in Spanish territory. The French here did not know how things stood between England and France. They might be at war right now, at this moment, and the French would have no way of knowing. And if you were a savvy English privateer who was returning from a semi-legal mission into the Pacific, well, do you remember after the first Pacific adventure how the English were betrayed by the French? They were kidnapped, put in chains, and almost sold to the governor of Saint-Domingue. However, they escaped, but if only 40 French buccaneers showed up to be shipped off on a ship that they were supposed to believe existed, well, they could be captured by the Mosquito with ease. Their confiscated plunder could be split between the Mosquito and the English, and they could be carried off to Port Royal in chains for summary execution. That would enrich the English privateers and get them back in the governor's good graces. Not only would they have made a fortune on this voyage, they would have made an additional fortune by capturing the French, and they would have earned their way back into the civilized world with one simple stroke. And who knows? That might have been the plan. Now, England and France were not at war, but they were very much on the verge of war. More on that next time. For now, the French decided to make the coast in strength and keep to themselves. It was a gamble, but they did have a trump card here. They had all of those freed slaves with them who were a balm on this situation. This was the haven that those freedmen were hoping for. The Mosquito Coast was home to hundreds or maybe even thousands of Maroons, from Jamaica to Cuba to Saint-Domingue, everywhere in the West Indies. This was a place of refuge for them. Now, this lot had traveled the very, very long way round from Port Royal to the Mosquito Coast, but they'd made it all the same. It's not impossible to think that they may have actually known people who were there. Ravenel de Lussan writes, quote, "On the 14th, the vessel arrived at the place where we were and came to anchor. About 50 of us, more vigilant than the rest, made a shift to enter her. Being piled, as it were, on top of one another, we weighed anchor and departed. The master would have carried us to Jamaica, But we, not knowing how matters stood between France and England, whether it were peace or war, engaged him to carry us to St. Domingo for 40 pieces of 8 a head. On the 17th we doubled the island of Providence, as the English call it, which was taken by the French and English under the colors of the last." End quote. They landed next at Cuba, and bought some food and water from the hunters they met there, but they were careful to be simultaneously menacing and polite. And they paid full price for everything they bought from those Spaniards because, quote, "we were uncertain whether our nation was at peace or war with the Spaniards, since we had no intelligence here from any French country." On the 6th of April we touched at a small borough on the coast, 7 leagues distant from Petit Guave, that so we might hear some news of our own country while we rode at anchor here. There were some of our people so infatuated with the long miseries we had suffered that they thought of nothing but the Spaniards, insomuch that when from the deck they saw some horsemen riding along the seaside, they flew to their arms to fire upon them, imagining they were enemies, though we assured them we were now come amongst those of our own nation. End quote. They were so infatuated with the long misery they had suffered that they almost fired upon their countrymen. That's PTSD. They'd been in enemy territory for years now. They had forgotten their other life. But Revenant de Luçon finally concludes his account with this passage. Quote, "We left this port and went to anchor in the port of Petit Guave, from whence we had departed almost 4 years before. And before we came near the fort, I went to Monsieur Dumas, the king's lieutenant, to require him to grant us protection and indemnity. By virtue of an amnesty the king had been pleased to send to those that made war upon the Spaniards since the peace." I kind of doubt that's how that actually happened. I imagine that guards and the threat of prison were involved, but that's what Luçon's lawyers would have wanted in the book. Finally, quote, "Lastly, when we were all got ashore to a people that spoke French, we could not forbear shedding tears of joy, that after we had run so many hazards, dangers, and perils, it had pleased the Almighty Maker of earth and sea to grant a deliverance and bring us back to those of our own nation. I cannot but add that, for my own part, I had so little hope of ever getting back that I could not, for the space of 15 days, take my return for any other than an illusion. It proceeded so far with me that I shunned sleep, for fear when I awaked I should find myself again in those countries out of which I was now safely delivered." End quote. And with that we're going to leave Revenant de Luçon and the French buccaneers who took part in the Second Pacific adventure. They were safely back home here at the beginning of 1688. Those English buccaneers at Cabo Gracias a Dios would make it home as well, and all of the rest of the French, but they only had a brief respite from the life. In the months that followed their return home, the tensions between the powers of Europe grew worse. It became clear that war was imminent, and the pirates had decisions to make. Would they take part in the war as legal privateers, as many of them had begun their careers, or would they instead choose to leave it all behind? We'll get into that and so much more in the coming weeks as we look at, next time, the dawn of the 9 Years' War.